You know, I had a bit of experience when the professor was saying, you know, something outrageous like asking for weekly lumbar punctures, et cetera. We were speaking of this last night. I was the patient advocate on the ibutolast study, the SPRINT study, and one of the original outcome monitors was going to be monthly lumbar punctures. So it was, you know, it's one of those things that sometimes, and we'll talk about this for those of you who attend the breakout seminar next, well, the one after this, about patient involvement. It was someone had to stop and say, well, do you actually want people to sign up for this study? Because if you're going to stick them in the lumbar and do a spinal tap every month, you're going to get no one. And if you do, they're not going to stay. So our next presenter is going to speak on managing the impact of invisible symptoms. Again, the hashtag is MyInvisibleMS, hashtag. And that will be presented by Professor Roshan das Nair. He's the clinical psychologist and professor of neuropsychology at Nottingham University Hospital. He spoke yesterday, and it was a brilliant talk. And what's the word on the AU up me duck or something from Nottingham? I'll let you explain that. So here's the professor to speak on that.
Well, good morning, everybody, and it's great to be here. My name is Roshan das Nair, and as mentioned, I work at the University of Nottingham. As you can see from this map, Nottingham is somewhere in the centre of England. I was born by the coast, so I'm now living possibly furthest away from the coast in England, and that makes me a bit sad. But we are a very resourceful people in Nottingham. So if we can't get to the beach, we have the beach come to us. So this is a picture of the Market Square in the centre of Nottingham. And every summer we have a beach that comes to us. So that's one thing that's really exciting in the summer in Nottingham. But Nottingham is famous for lots of other things. You may have heard about the rally bicycles that made the chopper bikes. Our lace industry, Boots the chemist, authors such as D.H. Lawrence and Lord Byron. But perhaps our most popular export is this fella. This is our Robin Hood, and this is the Robin Hood that we know of from at least, 1952. So he's a bit short, he's a bit stalky, stands quite quietly just below our castle. And if he were to speak, he'd probably say, "Hey up me dog," and which is really the Nottingham way of saying hello. So, "Hey up me dog," and thanks for inviting me to share my thoughts around experiences about researching about invisible symptoms in MS. But before I begin, I'd like to tell you a bit about how I ended up researching invisible symptoms. So I was out with a friend of mine shopping, doing my weekly grocery shop in a supermarket. I came out of the supermarket, and both my friend and I, we noticed that there was a woman who'd dropped her bags and her shopping, and there were apples and bananas strewed all around the parking lot. And she was parked in the bay where people with disabilities park. And so we decided to walk to her to help her pick up the fruit and her veg and everything. And then we noticed that she was actually very, very shaken. So we asked her, I mean, it's all right, you know, we said, it's okay, the shopping's okay. And she said, it's not that. And she handed us this little note that she'd found on her car. And it was a terrible note. And essentially, it had accused her of stealing a place that wasn't rightfully hers. She went on to explain, almost apologetically, that she'd had a stroke a few years ago, and as a consequence of that stroke, there were two things that were really troubling her. One was that fatigue was a major problem for her. So although she could walk, there were very short distances she could walk. But the bigger challenge, she said, was with her memory. Now, she didn't drive very often, and with the help of sat-nav and things like that, she did drive. But there was one trip she did every week, which was just from her house to the supermarket, which wasn't very far. And the thing that she found most difficult was forgetting where she had parked her car. Now, some of you may have had that experience, but for her, what was really important was for her to park the car at a place where she could see it the moment she stepped out of the supermarket. But the other thing, which was independent of her stroke, was the anxiety that she experienced. So what she wanted to do was to get there and leave as soon as she could. Several months later, my friend who had gone shopping with, she sent me this picture. This was a newspaper cutting from Australia, which, as you can see from the headline, a woman with MS asked, "Did you forget your wheelchair after parking in a disabled bay?" So when I looked at the literature, it appeared that individuals with invisible disabilities often struggle to convince others that they do not seek an unfair advantage, such as using up a parking slot. There were other things in newspapers that I found out. This is a cutting from The Guardian, where this person says, "Playing with my daughter, I noticed my fingers were numb. Then came the memory loss and the clumsiness." I noticed, again, on a trip to Australia, this was a poster that I just found somewhere, and I just had to take a picture of it. So increasingly, people are becoming aware that we need to start focusing on not just the visible symptoms of MS, but the invisible symptoms of MS. Therefore, it was perhaps unsurprising that the World MS Day, as its theme, had My Invisible Symptoms and the impact of invisible symptoms in people. This is a great publication that was produced by the US National MS Society. It's called But You Look So Good. And I'd urge people to look at it because it really kind of highlights some of the difficulties. And here's one. My neurologist, my family doctor, even my aunt's visiting nurse, they all say, "But you look so good for somebody with MS." And here's another quote that really drives home that point, that this is not something that only affects the individual, but it can potentially affect others also, and family relationships. "My wife wanted to meet me at a restaurant and I forgot and came home. She's insisting that I don't love her anymore." And I think the most difficult thing to cope with is the absolute dichotomy between how you look and how you feel. And this is something that a lot of people struggle with. Now, why am I doing this talk? In some ways, this is a rather difficult talk for me to give, because how do I tell people with MS and those who live with people with MS about the impact of invisible symptoms? Because these are things that you possibly experience and deal with on a daily basis. So I don't need to stand here telling you about this. So I thought long and hard about this, and I figured that perhaps there were a couple of messages that I could share based on our research with you. And one of them is, you're not alone. I wanted to share the words and voices of other people with MS that we've spoken to, and tell you that there are things that can be done to make things better. And because my own research focuses on memory, I'll give you a couple of examples from this. But there's some key principles I want to highlight first, that, as I mentioned, this presentation is based on discussions that we've had with people with MS and their families and research, but there is no one-size-fits-all, and there are no quick fixes. And some of the things I say may be applicable to you, but others might not be. So let's start off by talking about what are these invisible symptoms. You'd think that they're quite simple to define, but actually when we look at the studies, there's some discrepancy about what people consider invisible symptoms. But there is some agreement that these refer to symptoms that are hidden or not visible or overtly seen as debilitating to others. But I'd like to add to this definition that invisible symptoms can also be sometimes invisible to people with MS also, and I'll come to that again in a minute. Now, if you look at this slide, which depicts the different symptoms of MS, you'll notice that actually a lot of these symptoms can be considered invisible symptoms. But why is it that we need to recognize, or what's the importance of recognizing these symptoms? So one, they can be treated, or two, we can help people to learn to deal with these symptoms better. So I'm going to give you a few examples from our research into cognition. So cognition refers to people's ability to pay attention, to problem solve, but largely for people with MS, about 40 to 65% of people with MS, people have memory problems, particularly remembering to do things in the future. And we find that teaching people to use memory aids really, really helps. There's some research that shows that teaching people to use smartphones, for example, is useful in dealing with everyday memory problems. And this persists even after people are taught how to use these phones. So we did a small study with about 50 people with MS, and it's called the Neurotech study. So what we did in this is that we spoke to people with memory problems as a consequence of their MS, and we asked them, what are the kind of things that you're forgetting in daily life? And they gave us a list of things that they were forgetting. And another group of people, we asked them, okay, what kind of information would you like to get? And this has got nothing to do with cognition or MS, but just what are the kind of things that you're interested in? So people in one condition, the neurotext conditions, they got these memory reminders. So for example, have you taken your bins out? And then for the other condition, they just got some sports feeds. So for example, this was around the time when there was some European sporting championships happening in Azerbaijan. So this is from a news feed about that sporting event. And as I mentioned, people in the neuropage condition, they wanted reminders about their medication. They wanted reminders about taking, looking at their calendar or their diary, charging their phone, and preparing food. In the control text conditions, people wanted information, sporting information, some inspirational quotes, some specific news items, and so on. And what did we find? We actually found that those who got the actual text reminders to remind them to do something forgot less. They were compared to those who just got the news items. So just getting a ping on your phone doesn't make that much of a difference. What you would need is a specific type of prompt to get you to do a particular action. But the other interesting thing we found was that people who received the reminders, actually it improved their mood also, because forgetting things was bringing people's mood down. So this served to improve people's mood also. Another study that we've just completed with about 450 people with MS was our CRAM study. So in this study, what we did was we got people to either have their usual care or to get their usual care plus 10 sessions of our CRAMS rehabilitation. So what did this involve? This involved coming together in a group of 4 to 6 people with MS and with these memory problems and attention problems for about an hour and a half with a little break in between, once a week for 10 weeks. And they met with an assistant psychologist who discussed with them various aids that they could use. People were taught how to use different internal memory aids, like developing a story or developing categories of lists that they wanted to remember, or external memory aids using a diary or a mobile phone or even a calendar at home. And we also taught people about the impact that these memory problems can have in daily life and how to deal with those. We set homework assignments, so people came, they learned about these strategies, they went home, they tried them out. For some people, it didn't really work. For others, it worked with some adaptations. But the key thing was people came back and shared their experiences about what worked and what didn't work. So the spirit was really that of a toolkit approach. We know that there are different tools available, but you use different tools for different things at different times. And sometimes some tools work better for others than other tools. And what did we find? We found that people reported, in terms of their subjective reports, so people reported that they had better ability to pay attention and better memory at 6 months and 12 months. And the relatives, we asked relatives of people with MS what they thought about the impact of our rehabilitation, and they were reporting the same thing. We also saw that, people's mood, like in our other study, that also improved as a consequence of this attending the study. And people's quality of life also improved immediately after the rehabilitation. I was hoping to show you a video, but unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to show it to you today. And this was entirely my fault because it was only last night I had this brainwave and I remembered I had this video to show you, but it was too late. But my apologies for that. But if you look online and just type in Cram's trial, you'll find the video. This is Susan. So Susan's daughter has MS. And we worked with lots of patient and public involvement partners in our study. And Susan actually went and talked to people who were involved in our study. We wanted somebody independent. We didn't want to ask people who came to our study to say, how good was it, or how did you find it? Because that would create a certain degree of bias. So Susan went and spoke to them. And she found that lots of people were reporting positive benefits. So this is one example where one person says, I can't tell you how helpful it was being part of the group, just to meet other people going through similar things that we've been there, and we could all say to each other, yeah, I felt a bit stupid, but I found this way of dealing with a problem. Just sharing our ideas and stories was wonderful. So we were intrigued. We wanted to know what caused this change, because lots of people were telling us that there was a change. So one of the things that they told us was they were starting to use many more strategies to help them in their daily life. For example, people were forming habits of doing things. People felt they were improving in their confidence and their mood, and they were doing more things in their daily life also as a consequence of using some of these strategies. People felt that the educational aspect of our study was helpful, but most people talked very much about the impact of being with other people with MS, being together, sharing these experiences, understanding the social aspect of it. We had also produced a workbook to enable people to remember what strategies that we were talking about in the sessions, and people felt that that was useful also. I think it's some of the techniques, repeating things over and going over things over and over again and making stories. I just tend to go over it in my head. So after a while, it tends to sink in a little more. It's just some of the techniques I use a lot more. That's helping. So that's why people found this beneficial. But the other reason why looking at invisible symptoms is important is because we know that invisible symptoms are more predictive of distress than visible symptoms for most people with MS. So it's important that we study this. And you can understand why this might be the case. We notice that people with these symptoms, they tend to become more and more isolated. And when you're more isolated, what happens is that you have less activities to do and your mood goes down. And that actually makes potentially your symptoms a lot worse. And when your symptoms get a lot worse, you get more isolated. So you can see what happens over here is a kind of a vicious cycle, and it's very difficult to break out of those things if we're not careful, but things can be done to break out of it. But there are some challenges about doing research or thinking about invisible symptoms. The first thing is they're invisible, and that's a big challenge. And who are they invisible to? Well, they're invisible to a whole lot of people. For some people, they're invisible to themselves. They don't recognize that a symptom that they're having might be related to their MS. As we saw in one of the earlier quotes, the partners, family members who are very close to them can't recognize that this might be, this isn't somebody who is being malicious or bad in any way. It's just that they're struggling with their symptoms. Wider family and friends, sometimes even healthcare professionals, we don't get it right. We make mistakes because we don't often see some of these invisible symptoms. And as you saw from my first slide about that parking issue, wider society also, make mistakes around this. So what we did was we looked at collecting these stories from various research studies. So there were 17 research studies with close to 250 people with MS talking about some of these things. And what did we find? We divided them into 3 themes. The first one was about this issue about looking healthy but feeling ill. And as this person says, the most negative thing about MS, that it's hidden. I don't really look ill, and that's the worst thing about it for this particular person. And this person says it doesn't show on the outside, still you feel really ill. It's almost as if you want to shout, "Can't you see how I feel?" You can see that frustration. The second theme was around the impact of invisibility. So people with MS either felt stigmatized in terms of either feeling their condition was overemphasized or they were being ignored or invalidated. And I wanted to tell you a bit about some of these pictures that you're going to see on my slides. Now, these were painted by somebody who is experiencing really, really low mood. And we were paired together because I was invited to do this talk in Nottingham called A Pint of Science. I don't know if you've have those talks over there. So we get researchers to go out into pubs and talk to the public about what it is that we do in our clinics and in our labs. And they paired us with artists. And so these are original paintings that Michael did based on the information that I'd given him about these quotes that I'm showing you today. So people, the MS being overemphasized. So the first quote over here is somebody, a colleague speaking to another colleague about somebody with MS. So is she going to be able to do this with her MS? Making assumptions about people's abilities without actually checking with people what they want to do and what they're able to do. So just because you have MS, people making all these assumptions for you. But this is what the person with MS says. I want them to acknowledge that there are some things that I can't do, but I don't want that to change the way they look at me or treat me. And this is a wonderful quote, and it's so touching. People expect nothing of you. Nobody demands anything. I have no responsibility. It's frightening, I think, receiving disability pension, living alone, and having less and less responsibility and having less contact with people. And I'm frightened that my brain's going to be erased. This is such a powerful quote. And it highlights the impact of that invisibility, the isolation, the assumptions that people make, and the impact that it has. But the other way in which people are impacted is because their symptoms are ignored or invalidated. Now, these are some posters from the MS World, the World MS Day on the website. They've got wonderful posters that they encourage people to go and put out there to inform public about invisible symptoms. So here's somebody talking about fatigue. So people not understanding the impact of fatigue that it can have on you. It's really frustrating when you tell somebody you're tired and they say they know how they're feeling. They've had a big night last night too, you know, so. And here's another one, probably is just general ignorance that they're not aware of it, meaning MS, and they're not heard about the fatigue involved. And they just sort of say, oh yes, I know, I get so tired. And I think, how annoying, you don't. So, you know, there's a qualitative difference that people with MS talk about when they're talking about their fatigue. So even, as I said, clinicians sometimes don't get it. So in this case, this person's talking about a doctor she'd been to see. She treated me well, but it was not like she understood me. She didn't really listen to me, especially the psychological part, which is quite invisible and therefore very difficult. And we get this sometimes, you know, in a very rushed clinical appointment. Sometimes the most obvious things get discussed first, and some of the less obvious things don't get discussed very often. But for people with MS themselves, they were talking about how, because of their invisible symptoms, they themselves sometimes felt like an imposter when they went out to the MS clinics. When I go to the clinic, I feel like a complete fraud because, you know, I turn up generally from work in my business suit with my slap on, not a crutch or a wheelchair in sight, and, you know, feels like everybody else is looking at me saying, well, why is she here? And then the final theme that we talked about was this burden of choice, this continuous conflict about, you know, how do you tell people? Do you make the invisibility visible? And this is a continuous decision that people had to make, almost like coming out as having disability on a daily basis. And people constantly had to weigh the pros and cons very, very carefully, you know, in very tricky situations, because both telling people and not telling people have both positive and negative consequences. So there's some challenges about deciding to tell people. Whether to tell or not is the basic challenge, but then there are other challenges. There are things like, who do you tell? When do you tell somebody? How much do you tell somebody? and how do you tell people? So these are some of the things that we looked at. So this is a quote. One participant spoke about her disclosure about her MS during a job interview, and she was very bold and forthright about it. And she said, I think you should know I have MS, and there are times when I'm going to have to take a day off work and go to the MS clinic or a specialist or something. And the interviewer says, I would never have guessed. And she says, well, I don't wear a tattoo about the MS. Now, this worked for this person, but, it's not something we could advocate for everybody because it could potentially backfire in some instances. So, for example, in this case, this person says, she's talking about her colleagues, I don't trust how they, her colleagues, are going to behave if I say I have MS. I don't trust that I'll have my job again next year. Like, it feels better to me when people know, and yet I have this really hard time telling people. I mean, most of my life, I was the one who had a lot of energy, and I can still fake it. So for this person, they made an assessment, they made an informed choice that they were not ready to tell some of the colleagues because they didn't trust them as yet. For some people, it was about making the invisible visible. Now, here's a really interesting one where a participant describes using a mobility aid even when she didn't really struggle with mobility, but it helped her to make the invisible visible. I actually did an experiment with my doctors. I have a walking stick, which I very, very rarely use. And I went in one day without the stick and said, look, I'm having these migraines and I need this particular medication. And he gave me a really hard time giving me the script. I went in and saw him 4 weeks later, and I had my stick with me, and he wrote out a prescription, no problem. So you can see how people are, using creative, strategic ways to make the invisible visible, and using that, Now, I'm not placing a value judgment on this. What I'm doing is highlighting to you how people are using strategies to help them navigate some of these issues. And finally, people talked about educating others. Some participants highlighted they felt it was a sense of responsibility that they had to educate others about invisible symptoms to receive the support that they needed and deserved and needed the understanding. That's what I've learned over the years. I have to talk. They don't know how tired I am or how tired I am in my head. If you don't show them what's really going on inside you, you can't get the understanding of your colleagues. But the bottom line is we need to be careful about whether we want to disclose or not. This is an individual choice. It has to be made with a certain amount of consideration, weighing the pros and cons carefully. But why don't people realize about these problems? Well, they don't know that you have the symptoms. They don't remember. Sometimes you may have told them they've forgotten that you have these symptoms. They don't notice. They don't understand. They put two and two together and get 5, and sometimes maybe you're just doing a great job of hiding it so they don't understand again. So what can you do about it? Well, I think the first thing is to be aware of the various symptoms that people with MS can experience. And we've noticed that particularly younger people, and particularly closer put to the point of diagnosis, they're not always familiar with the different symptoms, so be aware of it. Some people we spoke to also talked about the importance of being in tune with your own body, recognizing what your body is telling you, and learning to work with what your body is telling you. So again, particularly for those who are newly diagnosed, they found this was a bit of a challenge for them. Think about who you can be open with, because we recognize that you can't, and you don't have to be open with everybody if it doesn't feel right. We also learned that connecting with family and friends is really, really important. And it's also important to help them understand these invisible symptoms. But most importantly, reach out to those who get it, others with MS, other societies or charities that provide people with the support, these support groups. They may have figured out how to deal with some of the issues that you're facing differently that you may not have thought about. So there's a shared resource over there that people should really be making use of. We did a study about the impact of families in relation to how people with MS experience their mood. So even if a person with MS thinks that the family is very important to them, what really matters is the rest of the family and the support that family members provide people with MS. So it wasn't just that directly related to the mood, but it was through this mechanism that people's mood improved. But what was also interesting was there was another mechanism by which people's mood improved, and that was people's willingness to join new groups and perform various activities. Which is why I think, groups such as the groups that MS Ireland and other such groups provide are so vital for, improving people's well-being through the course of their MS. So then people asked us, but what can you say? So we looked at ways in which people can explain invisible symptoms. We looked at the importance of providing gentle prompts and reminders when activities are planned, because as I said, people sometimes forget about it. So when an activity is planned, some people suggested that this is a formulation that would work. They would say, it's great that we're planning to go out on this walk, and I'm going to rest up before that because that's going to help me. I find that helps me before the walk. But if I wake up after I rest up and I don't feel very good, I might have to take a rain check on that. So preparing people for it so that, they're aware of it. That's what seems to help in some cases. And highlight when symptoms are playing up and being open about that. Using metaphors and similes, sometimes people felt that was really helpful. So this is a really great quote from the MS Trust in the UK. Imagine shaving with 4 pairs of gloves on, and then you'll get an idea. So, giving people an example, and, the pop-up over here is a great way of communicating some of those invisible symptoms. And I thought that was such a great initiative, and that's something I'm keen to take back and, get people to think about where I come from. And finally, I think it's very, very important to speak to your healthcare providers. There are always things to do that we can help to manage some of these symptoms. And it's difficult remembering these symptoms. So I would advocate keeping something like a health diary, because as I was talking to somebody yesterday, time clouds memory. And, sometimes people, how often do you get to see your neurologist or your MS nurse specialist? And oftentimes there's a lot of time that's passed between that consultation and your next one, and so much has happened. So some people we've worked with have found it really helpful keeping a diary of how they're feeling. And some of them who've started using, I don't do this, I don't wear a watch, but some people who wear smartwatches have used that as a way of tracking their sleep or, how much activity they're doing, and seeing some patterns around them, because you can go and discuss some of those patterns. But even if you don't do that, I would advocate taking a list of symptoms you want to talk about, because in a pressured 12-minute encounter, there's only so much you can talk about. And of course, there's so many other pressing things that the neurologist or the nurse wants to talk to you about. But this is just a little memory aid to help people to go along. And finally, in the last few minutes that I've got, I want to share with you a new project that we've started doing, and we're recruiting people for this project. We're doing what we call a photo voice study. And what we want to do is we want to explore how, in daily life, people with invisible symptoms of MS do 2 things. One is, how do they experience living with these symptoms? And the second thing, and this is perhaps more important, how do they manage these invisible symptoms? We want to kind of understand this innovation that's come from people with MS. So what is a photo voice study? This is a community-based participatory research to document what actually happens in real life. It's been used in studies to empower people. It's based on the principles of social action, and it helps to picture rather difficult or abstract concepts. So what are we doing? Well, we invite people to come and take part, and with a researcher, they learn about photo voice, they learn about the study, and then they go off and they take photographs. Most people who we've recruited so far have mobile phones, and they've got cameras on their mobile phones. So all they're doing is they're whipping out their mobile phones, taking photographs of things that they feel are representative of how they manage their MS invisible symptoms, and they send them off to our researcher. Some people have been given disposable cameras because they don't have mobile phones, so then they can take their photos. They send the photos back, and then they're invited to discuss those photos. We sit with those photos, and we talk about those photos. Because you recall, some people can't remember when they've taken this, particular incidents, but the photograph jogs their memory. And they say, yes, I took this photograph because this is what was happening. And we encourage them to write a little narrative. And then finally, what we want to do is we want them to select a few photographs that they think best describe their experience of invisible symptoms, and we want to have a public exhibition of that. So this is a similar study that we did in the past, but this is with family members or carers of people with MS. And this is a photograph taken by one of the participants. And she says, a wheelchair is a common sight. So there's nothing very remarkable about the photograph itself, but listen to her narrative. This is what she says. It's difficult to have a conversation when propelling a wheelchair. You cannot see the sitter's face, and you have to be aware of the pavement, the flooring condition. A wheelchair is a common sight, but few people need to think about the pusher or the passenger. And I thought that was so telling, and this picture really then, highlights this sentiment that this person is experiencing. So, as I said, the end result, what we're hoping to do is to have a public exhibition. The photographs are taken by people with MS. The narratives that accompany the photographs are the narratives of people with MS. And we're working with some curators in some museums to help people with MS to actually learn about curating an art exhibition. So the curators are going to be people with MS also, with the ultimate aim of educating the general public that some people with MS have invisible symptoms. And this is just an example over here of a similar kind of photo voice exhibit that was done to highlight the effects of poverty. What does it look like to live on less? So this was other researchers. This wasn't our research, but this was done by other people. And we think this is really quite vital, that we need to highlight the impact of invisible symptoms at all those different levels that I talked to you about, so that we can kind of prevent this kind of thing happening, because we don't want this to continue to happen. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be very happy to take some questions.
Yeah, the provincial. Professor, thank you very much. And we have some time for some questions. I know it was a very broad but in-depth talk. So again, Jason will have the microphones that we can go around if we have any questions. Oh, come along now. And you know what? We finished a bit early, and now Jason's not around with it, so we'll repeat it. So what is the question?
I was just wondering about the CRAMS trial. I've never heard of it, and I don't know what it means. And you referred to it in one of the slides and asked us to look up the video ourselves. So I wanted more details on that, please.
Sure. This is about the CRAMS trial. So the CRAMS trial was a trial which stands for Cognitive Rehabilitation of Attention and Memory in MS. And this was a study that we undertook, and it's soon going to be published. As I mentioned, we recruited about 450 people, and this was to enable people particularly with memory problems, to figure out ways in which they could work on their memory problems. So it was teaching people how to compensate for their memory problems in daily life. So if you just Google the word CRAMS and the word trial, the first hit that you get will be a University of Nottingham page, and if you click on that, you'll see the video, which is a summary of what the study was about, but also you'll find other resources like the manual that we used. And I'm going to be making these slides available, and they'll be on the MS Ireland website also, so you're welcome to click on it, but also get in touch with me if you need any further details. Yeah.
Other questions? Is there one in the back there? Jason? Raise your hand again just so Jason can see you. There we go.
I have only one thing to ask and spread the word. If we get one message out there today, is to promote people to park not on curbs of all things. Park in allocated spots, please, and leave curbs free.
Sorry,
Could you repeat that?
could you say the last?
Just repeat that again.
Well, just to, if we could encourage MS Ireland to launch a campaign to stop people parking on curbs, it annoys me knowing that my pet aid.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's vital. That is absolutely vital. And I think back in England, this is another thing that lots of people have been telling us, and I know that our members of parliament have been alerted to this also, and I think there's some discussion going around about that.
And we want to get that on. Jason, up front here, please. Just because it's broadcasting or webcasting or it's casting.
My invisible MS, and I suppose this is the first time really that I've become so aware of my invisible MS. I know I'm using a walker at the moment, but that's due to foot surgery. But everything you've spoken about there and the actual hiddenness inside me about it, and is it just a website I go on to now to kind of start at the foundation of it and to learn more about it?
The campaign that My Invisible Symptoms. When I stand here, I can't see.
That's all right.
And when I move there, you can't hear me. So, the My Invisible Symptoms. If you kind of look at that on Google, you'll find a lot of stuff, lots of material over there. That's really, really helpful. And we'll be putting out some material also about what we've found from our studies also.
Thank you indeed.
We've got time for one more question if anyone's got in the back there, Jason, on the left.
Oh, there's a lady over here.
All right, and then we'll get you in the back there, and then.
Hi, my name is Karina, and I have a blue badge. I'm a blue badge holder. I'm in favour of that lady that wrote, or the person that wrote that about the wheelchair, because I know in Cork there is very few. It's becoming less and less for blue badges where to park. And I see people abusing those blue badge and they haven't even got a blue badge and they're parking in those areas. So I just want to say that it's frustration, I'd say, that was written for, you know, by, not because you just can't see the disability, but because people park there and they don't need to. So you should need to look at that side of it as well. Okay, and that's all I want to say.
Absolutely. I mean, I appreciate that it will be very frustrating, but in this instance, the person did have a badge, so you know.
Exactly. I can appreciate that, but I can see from the other point of view how frustrating it is that you can't and you need to be able to park near a premises that you're going into. So I just wanted to just keep that in mind too, you know. But I do actually block people in that I know do not have a disability, you know. And I will leave my car there and come back to it in the evening if I have to, you know. But I do campaign rigorously to be understood, you know. So thank you.
Jason, I think there was one in the back row there, and then we'll wrap it up.
I just want to say I was clamped in St. Vincent's Hospital last week in an area where I was actually half in a disabled spot and half out of it. And it's just very frustrating because it's right across from the door and it's the easiest place to park, and there's always a bit at the end that you can park in without obstructing traffic. So like maybe yellow lines should be, I think those yellow lines should be removed, but people shouldn't be clamping people in hospitals with disabled stickers. I mean, I think that's cruel, you know. Yeah.
And then right next to Jason, there was another.
Hi, I hope I'm on the right track here now. But in terms with my invisible symptoms, right, I would find, like say, particularly with family members, that they've either said something and you've forgotten it, or you do think, am I being tested here? Like, but and in moments of upset, you might say something wrong. You'd say, look, I do have a problem with cognitive difficulties. And the answer you would get would be, I know, but it's very difficult. So like, in terms of close family and telling them that, if we can't get them to understand, then the broader community is very difficult. Like.
Absolutely. And that's a very good point. And I'll just share with you what one of our participants in the CRAMS trial did, because she was experiencing something like that, particularly with two of her, teenage daughters who were becoming a bit cheeky because, they were saying things like, "Mom, remember the £10 I gave you the other day?" And, she was like, "What £10?" And said, no, you did borrow that, because... the strategy she developed was ingenious, I thought, because she said, although this is my problem, it's no longer just my problem, it's everybody's problem. So what she instituted was a family diary, which she'd hung to her, tied up to the fridge with a little pen over there, and she says, now, the next time you've told me something, I want it to be written there. If it's not written in the family diary, you haven't told me. So I liked that because it then kind of co-opted others to kind of help with her, with the difficulties that she had. So things like picking up one of the daughters from a cello lesson or whatever it was, other people needed to kind of chip in and help out. And for her, that made quite a lot of a difference. So, but I take your point that, we need to start at home before we can kind of go outwards.
We do, because I do believe the fact that you do kind of get paranoid and you're wondering, you're saying, no, you didn't tell me, and I did tell you. Yeah. And even towards the end of my working days, I felt that, I nearly felt I was blaming the people in the wrong because they were so right and I was wrong. You do become paranoid, especially with cognitive difficulties.
All right, Professor, we thank you very much for your time. Here's a token of our appreciation, so thank you very much. And a big hand for Professor.
Thank you very much.